Sagittarius, the father you lost, the truth you finally found. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we spend a lifetime walking around, hoping they'll disappear if we don't touch them. Sagittarius, welcome back to Zodiac Wisdom. Tonight I want to invite you into a story that doesn't rush, doesn't demand anything from you, but simply asks you to sit with a feeling you may have carried for years, that silent, unfinished space between you and someone who should have stayed but didn't. This is not a story about blame, not a story about forgiveness either. It's a story about the quiet terrain between the two, a place where many Sagittarius hearts have wandered, searching for the truth behind a wound that never fully explained itself. Imagine this as the opening scene of a film, a winter evening, a woman standing at the doorstep of a house she hasn't seen since childhood. Inside that house is a man she once called father, a man who disappeared long before she learned how to name the loneliness he left behind. There are no dramatic violins here, just the soft hum of a heater, the sting of cold air on her cheeks, and the strange mix of dread and hope that only Sagittarius knows too well, that curious, painful optimism that whispers, maybe this time the story will be different. Tonight, we explore what happens when a Sagittarius heart returns to the origin of its wound, and discovers that the past was not what it seemed. We walk through memory, misunderstanding, and the fragile attempt to reconnect with someone who broke the bridge long before you knew how to cross it. So take a breath, let the room soften around you, and step with me into this story not just to understand the father she lost but to understand the truth she finally found, and maybe somewhere inside that truth to understand something about yourself too. The story begins in the quiet breath of a winter city, the kind of cold that doesn't hurt, but reminds you that you're alive. It was late afternoon, that moment when the world slips into gold for a few minutes before turning blue again. The streets were soft with snow that had melted and frozen back into a thin, shimmering frost. Traffic hummed in the distance, but here, on this quieter avenue lined with old houses, time felt slower, almost suspended. Elena, 34, Sagittarius to the bone, walked along the sidewalk with a small overnight bag hanging loosely from her shoulder. Her steps were steady, but her breath kept catching in that fragile space between fear and anticipation. She had not been here for 20 years. Not since the night everything in her life had changed without warning. She told herself she was fine, that she was only here to hear him out, that she was old enough, healed enough, distant enough. But as she reached the house, his house, something in her chest tightened like an old door that hadn't been opened in decades. The house looked smaller than she remembered. The paint was peeling, the windows slightly fogged from the inside. A wind chime hung by the porch, its soft metallic ring drifting into the cold air. She remembered that sound. It had been her mother's favorite, something she insisted on putting up even when he complained it was too loud. Funny the things memory chooses to keep. She paused at the gate. Her hands trembled, not from the cold. A part of her, the part she hated admitting still existed, wished he had come running to the door the moment her footsteps touched the path, that he would open it with tears in his eyes, like some dramatic reconciliation from the film she pretended not to watch. But the door stayed closed. The house stayed silent. She exhaled long and slow, letting the steam of her breath disappear into the winter air. Inside her bag was a small wooden box. She'd found it last week while cleaning her apartment, a box he'd given her when she was 13, the last birthday he ever spent with her. Inside were drawings she'd made as a child, a few dried flower petals, and a note she'd written in shaky handwriting promising she would always be brave like Sagittarius. She didn't remember writing that. She didn't remember being that brave. Life has a way of softening courage when it's asked to work overtime. She pushed the gate open. It creaked, of course it creaked, as though even metal protested this reunion. The porch steps were icy, and she walked slowly, half afraid of slipping, half afraid of reaching the door. She lifted her hand, hesitated, then knocked. 3 soft knocks. Too soft for someone who had spent years pretending she didn't care. A minute passed. Then another. And just as she prepared to turn away, the door opened. He stood there. Older. Thinner. More tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper, as though time had been unkind, pressing its fingerprints into his skin. His hair was more gray than she expected, but the eyes, those dark, contemplative eyes, were the same, familiar in a way she wished they weren't. "Elena," he breathed as though the name itself surprised him. She swallowed. Hi. It was all she could manage. He stepped aside without speaking, letting her into the house. She walked past him, feeling the warmth of the room brush against her cold cheeks. The house smelled faintly of old books and pine wood, a scent that sent her straight back to childhood winter nights when she'd curl on the sofa and wait for him to come home. Some memories are stubborn. They refuse to die even when we ask them to. She removed her coat, hanging it on the same wooden hook she used to use. She hated that her body remembered where it belonged. He watched her quietly, almost cautiously, as though she were a wild bird that might fly away if he moved too fast. You've changed, he said softly. She let out a small humorless laugh. That's what 20 years will do. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. A silence grew between them, not awkward but heavy, like something waiting for permission to speak. She looked around the living room. It was surprisingly neat. A framed photograph on the mantel caught her eye. A picture of her at age 10, missing a front tooth, grinning proudly at the camera. She frowned. You kept this. He didn't look up. I kept everything. The word struck her in a place she didn't expect. Something warm flickered in her chest. Not hope but the ghost of it. She walked further into the room, letting her fingertips trail across the back of the sofa. The edge of a shelf, the small ceramic bowl filled with keys and coins. Everything felt lived in, familiar but distant, like stepping into a parallel life she could have had. He hovered near the doorway, unsure if he was allowed to come closer. Thank you for coming, he finally said. She didn't respond, not because she didn't want to, but because any answer felt too small for the storm inside her. Instead, she said the only thing she could. I don't know why I'm here. He nodded slowly. That makes two of us. For the first time, she glanced at him fully, really looked. And in that fleeting second, she saw something fragile in his face. Not guilt, not regret, something more complicated. Something she couldn't name yet. But it made her stay. Not forgive. Not forget. Just stay. And sometimes, for a Sagittarius heart, that's the bravest beginning of all. The first night passed quietly. Elena slept in the small guest room at the end of the hallway, a room that once belonged to her when she was a child. The wallpaper had changed, the furniture was different, but the window was the same. She remembered lying awake as a girl, tracing constellations in the sky and making silent wishes she never dared say aloud. Now, years later, she found herself staring at that same window, wondering if the stars remembered her back. Morning came softly. She followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen, where he was standing by the stove, awkwardly stirring a pot of oatmeal. He looked up, surprised again, as if he half expected she would vanish during the night. I wasn't sure how you liked your breakfast now, he said, voice low. You used to hate oatmeal, but then you suddenly loved it at 14. I never understood that phase. She blinked. He remembered that. A tiny, almost invisible thread tugged inside her chest. He handed her a mug of coffee, black, exactly the way she drank it. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't want to break the illusion forming in the room, this delicate, trembling thing that felt like the beginning of something long overdue. They sat at the small wooden table, sunlight spilling across the faded tablecloth. Conversation was slow, careful, but every now and then he would mention something. An old book she loved, a memory she thought he'd forgotten, a detail about her childhood only someone who truly paid attention would know. With each detail, a new thread of connection wove itself into her. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, she began to draw him in her mind. Not the father who left. Not the man who disappeared without a word. But a gentler version, someone who had always cared, always watched from afar, always carried guilt like a hidden scar. It was the kind of story Sagittarius hearts are so good at building. Not a lie, just a softer truth. Later that afternoon, they went for a short walk around the neighborhood. The sky was gray, the air crisp. He walked a half step behind her, as if unsure he deserved to walk beside her yet. At one point she slowed down so he could catch up. A small gesture, but in her chest it felt enormous. They passed by Mrs. Willow's house, an elderly neighbor who used to give Elena cinnamon cookies after school. The old woman noticed them from her porch. My goodness, Mrs. Willow exclaimed. Is that little Elena? Elena smiled politely, but it was the next thing the woman said that caught her off guard. He talked about you every week. Said he hoped you were doing well. Said he kept every drawing you made. Elena froze. Something warm, fragile, hopeful bloomed inside her. Her father quickly looked away, pretending to admire a tree. In that moment, a part of her began stitching a story together. Maybe he didn't leave because of me. Maybe he didn't stay away because he didn't care. Maybe he had reasons nobody ever told me. It was a dangerous comfort, the kind that feels like healing, but is really just an imagined bridge over a truth you're not ready to face. The mind of a Sagittarius works this way. When given one soft detail, they build an entire universe around it. That evening, she wandered into the living room and found a wooden drawer half open. Curiosity nudged her fingers to slide it further. Inside were items wrapped in paper, old photos, letters, ticket stubs, tiny fragments of a life that once included her. One photo stopped her breath. It was of her, age 8, standing in front of a school project. He was beside her, smiling proudly, his hand on her shoulder. She didn't remember the moment, but he had kept it. Beside the photo was a small notebook. She opened it. Inside were pages filled with dates and short notes. Elena won a prize today. Elena broke her wrist, rushed to her. Elena's first recital, she looked beautiful. Elena turned 16. I hope she's happy. Each line pulled her deeper into the version of him she wanted to believe in. A man who left not because he didn't love her, but because he was forced into an impossible circumstance. A man who never stopped thinking of her. She closed the notebook, holding it gently against her chest. When he walked into the room and saw her standing there, something flickered in his eyes. A mixture of embarrassment and longing, like someone caught leaving the lights on in a room they were afraid to enter. You kept all of this? She asked, voice soft. He nodded. It was all I had. In her heart, the imagined version of him grew brighter, fuller, kinder. She filled in the gaps he didn't explain. She softened the edges of his silence. She painted his absence with colors that hurt less than the truth. That night, she sat by the living room window. Snow fell quietly outside, blanketing the world in white. He sat on the opposite side of the room, fixing a loose hinge on a cabinet, a small domestic sound that felt strangely comforting. In the soft glow of the lamp, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. Maybe this was the father she'd always wanted. Maybe beneath the years of distance, he had always cared. Maybe they could rebuild what was broken. Maybe, Sagittarius hearts don't fall in love with people. They fall in love with potential, with the story they create from scattered signals. And Elena, without realizing it, had begun to fall in love with the father she imagined he might have been. Not the father he truly was. Not yet. The next day unfolded quietly, the way winter mornings often do, slow, silver blue, wrapped in a kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it is. Elena woke early. She had barely slept. Something in her chest felt unsettled, like a truth pacing behind a locked door. She came downstairs and found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea that had gone cold. The sunlight touched his face, revealing lines she hadn't noticed before, not just from age, but from years of holding something heavy. He looked up and forced a smile. Morning. She smiled back, but something about the moment felt off. As though the room had shifted slightly without warning. They had planned to visit the small town center that afternoon, a place she used to love as a child. She thought it might help them reconnect, maybe even pull more gentle memories to the surface. The walk began peacefully. He talked more than usual, pointing out shops that had closed, new buildings that had taken their place, and funny stories from neighbors she barely remembered. She listened, letting the cold air flush her cheeks, letting his voice fill the spaces where anger used to live. But halfway through their walk, something happened, small, but sharp enough to fracture the illusion she'd been building. They stopped at a bakery. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, releasing the warm scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. The woman behind the counter greeted them. And then she said something Elena didn't expect. It's been a while since your wife was here with you. Elena froze. His face tightened. Only for a second, but she saw it. Oh, the woman corrected herself quickly, noticing Elena's expression. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I thought. It's fine. He cut in softly. But it wasn't fine. Not for Elena. Wife. With him. Recently, the woman's slip revealed more than she intended. A presence. Partner. Someone he hadn't mentioned. Someone who had apparently been here with him in all the years she was not. Something inside Elena sank. The warm bakery suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. The air thickened around her, and every unasked question clung to her skin like static. She stepped outside, swallowing the sting rising in her throat. He followed, silence stretching between them like a thin sheet of ice waiting to crack. "Elena," he began. She held up a hand. "It's okay. You don't owe me an explanation." But the truth was she wanted one. She had built a version of him in her mind these past 2 days. A version where he had no one else. Where he had spent the years alone, missing her, loving her from a distance. And suddenly that version crumbled. They continued walking, but the mood had shifted. Earlier she had walked beside him. Now she kept a step ahead. Earlier, she had listened for meaning in his words. Now she heard only what was actually being said. At one point he asked, "Are you cold?" "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Sagittarius hearts can endure almost anything, except the feeling of being wrong about someone. Later, back at the house, he finally spoke. "I should have told you," he said quietly. "About her." Elena sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly. "You don't owe me your life story." His shoulders sank. "Maybe not. But I owe you the truth." She looked up. For the first time she saw not the man she imagined, but the man standing in front of her. Flawed. Human. Conflicted. "She came into my life after your mother and I." His voice trailed off. "After I left." The word hit her like a cold wind. Left. Simple. Direct. True. But hearing it aloud was different. It punctured every imagined narrative she had woven these past 2 days. "And you didn't tell me because?" she asked. He hesitated. Not knowing what to say was its own kind of answer. The evening unfolded in fragments. A tense silence during dinner. A dropped fork. A half-finished sentence. A truth she could feel but couldn't name. And then came the moment that broke the version she'd been drawing. She found a photo frame on his desk, one she hadn't noticed before. In the picture, he was standing beside a woman, smiling. Not polite smiling, but the kind of smile that comes from steadiness, from companionship. The woman's hand was in his. Their bodies leaned into each other with the ease of long familiarity. He looked happy. Not haunted. Not broken. Not aching for the daughter he left behind. He looked like a man who had made a life and moved on. Something inside her cracked. She set the frame down gently, as if it were fragile, though the fragile thing was her. She whispered, "I didn't know you had someone." "I didn't think you'd want to hear about that," he replied. "Not yet." She faced him. "You think I'm a child who can't handle the truth?" "No," he said, pained. "I think you're someone I hurt. And I didn't want to hurt you again." There it was, the truth she had been circling all day. He hadn't built a life in mourning. He hadn't spent every year waiting for redemption. He had hurt her, and moved forward anyway. The version she'd been painting, the devoted father who never stopped thinking of her, who lived in regret, dissolved like snow in warm hands. And in that dissolution, clarity arrived. The Sagittarius kind of clarity, painful, awakening, sharp as glass. She realized she had been filling in the blanks with hope. She saw depth where there was only distance. She had constructed a narrative from scattered pieces because the truth felt too empty. She had fallen in love with a story, not a person. And for the first time she wondered, had she ever truly known him at all? The night ended quietly. He went to his room. She stayed in the living room, staring at the dark window. Not crying, not angry, just seeing him, seeing herself, seeing the truth she'd been trying not to touch. And sometimes that moment when the imagined version collapses is the beginning of real healing. That night Elena didn't sleep. She sat by the window, knees pulled close to her chest, watching the reflection of herself in the glass. A faint outline against the darkness outside. The house was silent. Even the heater seemed hesitant to make noise, as if it respected the weight of the moment. Every so often, she pressed her forehead to the cold pane, letting the chill soften the heat behind her eyes. She wasn't crying. Sagittarius rarely cry when they break. They analyze first, they make sense of the pain. They search for the meaning hidden beneath the bruise. And that was exactly what she was doing now. She replayed the day in fragments. The bakery woman's slip, the photograph of the woman beside him, the look in his eyes when he realized she had seen the truth he never intended to share yet. It all swirled together into a single heavy question. Why did I create a version of him that never existed? She exhaled shakily, and the answer arrived gently, painfully, like a memory resurfacing. Because that's what Sagittarius does. They build bridges out of thin air. They fill in missing chapters. They soften the harshness of reality with potential. Not because they're delusional, but because hope has always been their survival mechanism. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness explain what she couldn't yet say out loud. Sagittarius idealizes not out of naivety, but out of emotional intelligence twisted into self-protection. They look at the absence and paint meaning into it. They take the smallest kindness and turn it into proof that someone cares. They connect dots that were never meant to be connected. Sagittarius hearts are storytellers, especially when it comes to the people they want to love. Elena had done exactly that. When she found the notebook with his old notes about her, she didn't just see a father who had moments of sentiment. She saw a man who had never stopped loving her. A man who had lived with regret. A man who had kept her alive in his heart every single day. She saw what she needed to see. Sagittarius don't fall in love with people, they fall in love with the possibility of what those people could mean. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. A soft ache spread through her chest, not sharp enough to hurt, but heavy enough to keep her awake. There in the quiet, Elena admitted something she had never said before. It was easier to believe he missed me than to accept he moved on. The words hovered in the air, fragile but true. Sagittarius hope projection. A pattern almost invisible until the moment it breaks. When Sagittarius care, they don't do it halfway. They don't test the water. They dive in, head first, heart open, narrative ready. And when the other person leaves gaps, emotional gaps, communication gaps, story gaps, Sagittarius fills them with the most beautiful possibilities their mind can construct. Because the alternative, the empty truth, hurts too much. She pressed her palms together, grounding herself. Another realization arrived, quieter, deeper. She hadn't just been searching for her father. She'd been searching for the version of herself that had been abandoned. The little girl who waited on the porch. The teenager who told her friends she didn't care. The woman who carried a wound disguised as independence. She hadn't come here to understand him. She'd come here to feel chosen finally, after decades of not being. And that's where Sagittarius pain often begins. Not in what the other person did, but in what Sagittarius hoped the other person meant. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes as the truth sharpened into clarity. Sagittarius fear looking directly at the dark parts of people they want to love. Not because they can't handle the truth, Sagittarius handle truth better than almost any sign, but because they see potential so brilliantly that reality feels like a betrayal of what could be. They choose the light. Even when the shadows tell a different story, they choose the version that hurts less. Even when the truth sits quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. She let her gaze drift to the photo frame on the desk, the one with him and the other woman. Earlier, it had shattered her illusion. Now it simply told the truth. He had built another life. He had found companionship. He had moved forward without her. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't cruelty. It was just life. And maybe, if she hadn't been so eager to rewrite the past, she might have seen that sooner. Sagittarius hate looking at the empty space where love should have been, so they fill it. They create depth where there is none. They project meaning onto crumbs of affection. They read poetry in silence. And when the illusion collapses, they don't grieve the person, they grieve the story they wrote. A soft fatigue washed over her. But it wasn't defeat. It was a quiet understanding. She whispered to herself, barely audible, I didn't love him. I loved the idea that he could fix the part of me he broke. There it was. Her truth. Her clarity. Her mirror. Sometimes the wound needs the real story, not the beautiful one. Down the hallway, she heard him shift in his bed. A small, tired sound. For the first time, she understood that he wasn't a villain. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't the devoted father she imagined or the heartless man she had blamed. He was just a man who made a mistake and kept walking because stopping hurt too much. And she was a Sagittarius who built a constellation out of 3 stars. By the time the clock ticked past 3 a.m., something inside her had already begun to settle. Not healed, not resolved, but honest. The truth had finally replaced the fantasy. And in that honesty there was a new kind of peace. A quiet one. A grown one. The kind that lets you step out of the story you wrote and into the life that's actually waiting for you. Morning arrived in a pale wash of light, slipping through the curtains like a hesitant apology. Elena opened her eyes slowly, her body heavy but her mind strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long night of truths. Not peace yet, but honesty. And sometimes honesty is the beginning of peace. She walked into the kitchen, expecting awkwardness. But he was already there, standing at the counter holding 2 mugs. One for him, one for her. He looked up. Their eyes met, and for the first time she didn't look away. He didn't smile. She didn't either. But the shared silence wasn't sharp the way it was last night. It was human. She sat down. He set the mug in front of her and rested his hands on the table, palms open like someone finally ready to stop hiding. "Elena," he began, voice gravelly from sleep. "I know you saw the picture yesterday." She nodded gently. "I didn't mean to start something with lies," he said quietly. "But I didn't know where to begin telling you the truth." She looked at him, really looked this time. Not as the father she wanted. Not as the man who had left. But as a person carrying his own scars. She breathed in. "Then start now." A long pause. Then a breath he had been holding for years. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you," he said. "I left because I didn't know how to be a father. Your mother, she was strong. She was steady. I wasn't. And instead of admitting that, I ran." His voice cracked. "I thought you'd be better without me." Something inside Elena shifted, not forgiveness, not approval, something closer to understanding. Pain shaped differently. "I was wrong," he whispered. She swallowed, the words hitting a tender place she didn't want to touch. He continued. "I built a life. Yes, but not because I forgot you. Every year on your birthday I wrote something down. When you were sick that year, I drove to the hospital but stayed in the parking lot because I didn't know if I had a right to see you." Elena's chest tightened. She didn't imagine everything. She didn't imagine the notebook. She didn't imagine the pieces of tenderness. But she also hadn't imagined the wounds in him. The fear, the inadequacy, the belief that leaving was protection. It wasn't an excuse. But it was a truth. She whispered, "I needed you." "I know," he whispered back. "And that's what I will regret forever." And for the first time since she arrived, Elena cried. Soft, almost silent tears. Not the explosive tears of anger, but the slow, tired tears of someone grieving the father they wanted and meeting the father they had. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't invade her space with apologies or promises. He simply stayed, which for him was the biggest step he'd ever taken. When her tears finally slowed, she breathed out, "I don't know how to forgive you." His eyes softened. "I didn't come looking for forgiveness, only a chance to know you again." The sentence landed in the quiet like something fragile and sacred. She didn't promise. She didn't commit. She didn't fix everything. Instead, she said the truth. "I don't know what we can be, but I'm willing to see." And for him, for a father who failed, fell, fled, it was more grace than he ever expected. They spent the rest of the day doing nothing extraordinary. He fixed a broken drawer. She helped him sweep the porch. They took out old boxes and sorted through them. A few shared memories. A few silences that didn't sting the way they used to. Small things. Ordinary things. But for a father and daughter with 20 years of distance between them, ordinary was a miracle. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No cinematic hug in the snow. No grand speeches. Just 2 people meeting in the middle of a long broken road and deciding to walk a few steps together. As evening approached, Elena stood at the doorway, her bag packed. She would return home that night. She needed space, but not the kind that pushes someone away. The kind that allows something new to form. He walked her to the gate, the winter air cool on their skin. When she turned to him, she said softly, "You can call me. Not every day, But sometimes, a tremor passed through his expression, relief, gratitude, disbelief. "I'll try," he said, and she knew he meant it. Trying for him was a new language. Before she stepped away, she reached out, placing her hand briefly on his arm. A gesture small enough to miss, but powerful enough to rebuild something that once seemed unsalvageable. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "You too," he replied. As she walked away, snow began to fall again. Not heavy, just enough to blur the outlines of the street. She breathed in the cold air, and for the first time it didn't sting. She realized something. Healing didn't mean rewriting the past. Healing meant accepting that her father was not the hero she needed, but also not the villain she imagined. He was simply a man she could grow into understanding. Slowly, gently, imperfectly. And she, a Sagittarius, could finally love him not through fantasy, not through potential, not through the story she once wrote to survive, but through the truth of who he was and who she was becoming. A daughter who no longer needed the perfect father, only an honest one. And he finally was ready to try.